So one of the things that I think is very important to talk about, because I did note it, you didn't talk about it a lot in the book, but you did mention modern monetary theory. And obviously you have your thoughts on that. We do support that concept. I think that there is something to be said for the ability to print money because we are a currency issuer. We're one of, I think, like 13 countries in the world that do it. It's also one of the reasons why, we have a currency that other nations use and we're able to control their markets. That's a whole other layer we don't have to get into here. But the point is, if you do have the ability to print money, and the goal is obviously to control inflation, and if so much of our money is wasted, why not be investing it in areas that would make a lot of sense? See, not everybody is obviously capable of being an entrepreneur, being a small business owner. Maybe for some people, having a federal jobs guarantee does make a lot of sense. And having the ability, especially to work on our infrastructure, which is so devastatingly bad, compare it to any of the other major countries in the world, especially China, we are very far behind. And if we're ever going to compete, having the ability to have the government work on behalf of working people, I think would be important. Obviously, making sure that it's executed correctly is very important. But certainly from the perspective of having a jobs guarantee, especially under circumstance, I think does make sense. How do you feel about that? And would you be agreeable that it would be something that would have to be based on maybe a specific time period, a specific goal in mind? How would you see it?
So let me ask you this, like, what is it that you think the government does well?
That's a good question. The government really doesn't do much well, but there's a big difference. For example, one of the arguments that gets made constantly is, and I would say probably one of the more prominent problems that we do have above everything else is, of course, healthcare. And so when the argument for Medicare for all gets brought up and you speak about it with somebody who, let's say, is on the political right, their attitude is, well, I don't want the government running my healthcare. Well, that's not what Medicare for all is. Medicare for all is government-funded healthcare. We already have it. It's Medicare. The difference is we would now expand it and give it to everybody. I don't want anybody controlling what my doctor is capable of making if the free market dictates that they're the best option that's out there. If you're a great doctor and you have the ability to make $500,000, $1 million a year because you can have a backlog of 3 months deep because every person in, let's say, Broward and Palm Beach County think you're the greatest doctor in Boca Raton, I don't care. Let them make that money. That's their business. What I don't need are for-profit middlemen, the cronyism of capitalism that do not bring any value whatsoever to the table, siphoning 1/3 of the money we put into healthcare into their pockets. If we cut that out, think about the financial freedom and opportunity that small businesses would have by having Medicare for all. We don't want the healthcare that's in Cuba. We don't need socialized medicine in the sense that the government runs everything. What we need is a system where people are able to basically have what they have now without having the for-profit middlemen that are screwing us over. So that, in a way, I think relates to the government funding an operation, not running an operation. That's the distinction that I think we try to be very clear on. And that's kind of where we get bogged down in the minutia of, well, you just want the government to do this and that. No, we really don't. But we also recognize where the government's value really needs to be made.
Yeah, and I think that this is where good intentions and good outcomes completely split. And I think the intention of having everybody have healthcare that is more affordable and certainly better than the current messed up system that we can all agree is just a complete cluster, right? I think that's where we all can agree. Coming out of the last 18 months and thinking that the government's actions in terms of picking winners and losers, the flip-flopping on healthcare, the flip-flopping on mask stance, the flip-flopping on the Trump vaccine bad, the Biden vaccine good, all of these things. And then the funding, the way that they allocate funding. I mean, we saw it in terms of what went to small businesses versus what went to the big guys in terms of the CARES Act, what was called relief. I mean, the fact that we think that the government, even if you believe that they won't get into running it, could then allocate it, or that this wouldn't become politicized, and that our healthcare, the funding for our healthcare could potentially get caught up in a giant partisan debate. Again, I think it's a nice, good intention, but I don't think that the outcome is realistic. Where I think what we could have. I think the problems that we have in healthcare is caused by the government interference in the market. We have nothing that looks like a free market in main healthcare. You have a couple of big guys who, supply the big companies. You have a couple, or one guy that like supplies the government. That takes up most of the healthcare. And then you have this kind of weird exchange system in the middle. You have all these rules and regulations that actually prevent sort of free exchange, and the areas in healthcare where there is something that looks more like the free markets, things like elective surgery, we've actually seen much more innovation. We've seen the prices going down. So if we moved everybody from the government and the business, as well as kind of, all of us who don't want to be beholden, because it's just stupid. We all agree it's stupid that we should be beholden to jobs to get healthcare. If we all moved into a free market system where we actually had free choice, like we do to insure anything else in our lives or to purchase anything else in our lives, that would have all of the good hallmarks of competition, which lowers prices, innovation, and not running it through the government. So I think where we kind of, again, I think we're all hitting around the edges of the same things, but in terms of the intentions versus the likely outcomes based on all of the data and our knowledge of sort of the diseconomies of scale in government itself to execute things appropriately. I mean, the system that you're talking about would require having the best, most competent people in government at all times to get it done. And I would just contend that a system for governance does not work well when the requirement is to have the best people, and certainly not the way that we elect people, right? On a popularity contest, it's not like we go through and we find experts and people who really know what it is that they're talking about. So you just look, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on and who you don't like in Congress, just think about those people. Do you really want those people in charge, even if it's just funding healthcare and deciding what things are important? I just feel like there's a better way. But I feel like it's a little off track to our main discussion.
No, I understand that. The reason I don't think it's off track is for this one reason, because I am a small business owner, and I do think that healthcare is one of the biggest expenses that small businesses have to deal with. Being responsible for the financial burden of your workers is a very big part of the problem. And so,
and it also makes you anti-competitive with big businesses, because they're obviously able to go in and negotiate these better packages with a handful of companies. That they can go in with one company, and that becomes a barrier for you to finding better employees. So I agree that getting that out of the way would be certainly a better option, and would make things a more even playing field.
Okay, so then let me ask you this. Let's say we were to come to the negotiating table and we were to say, all right, we want to make sure that everybody in this country has health care, and we don't need for-profit middlemen getting in the way of doctors and nurses. And obviously, you mentioned electives, which is fine. I don't think that everything. I agree with you. I don't think everything needs to be covered. I think the basics need to be covered. I think most people would agree with that. The ability to have a primary care doctor, the ability to go to the hospital in case there's an emergency. If people want to get different types of elective surgeries and things like that, I think you should have a free market option if that's what you choose to do. I think that being able to have basically flip the system we have now, which is basically have a public system with a private option, rather than basically a private system with it's not even a public option if you really want to look at it that way. But I do think if we did have a basic system, a government funded system, a single payer system, which is what the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world has, but you were able to have a free market option if you wanted to get even more quality care, I would have no problem with that. And I would think most people would come to the negotiating table. And why? Because you wouldn't have to buy into a private option. You can choose to buy in. That's an economic freedom. But considering, the fact that we're the only country in the world that has medical bankruptcy as an example, these are the types of things that I really do believe we can find the common ground on. Like I said, I don't want the government running healthcare. That's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be able to take our tax dollars and work on our behalf. Now, I know you'd make the example of, well, when do they ever do that correctly?
Right. I think that's the fundamental principle that you just really have to kind of get your head wrapped around. like a handful of people are never going to work on your behalf. That it's just against human nature. The reality is you're going to do a better job advocating for yourself. So where I would be okay, so if we're at the negotiating table, is saying, well, why don't we have a system where, you know, we fund, like, or the government says you need to, instead of like paying into Medicare, you can pay into your own HSA type of account. And again, we kind of bring everybody into the free market so that you have the competition, because one of the things you don't have when you have a single payer system is you don't have any competition. And I don't know anywhere that exists where having a lack of competition breeds innovation, brings down prices, and creates more accessibility. So I think that we want to make sure, like you said, that we don't have this insane system with opacity and with ridiculous costs. But the reason, again, we have that is because it's not capitalism. It's not a free market. We don't have the ability to go and freely exchange. We have a handful of options which are tied to these big anchor entities that are filled with cronyism, not a true free market. And again, healthcare isn't my sort of 100% area of expertise, but I would say Ovik Roy of FreeOp wrote some really great, he studied sort of all the different systems, and he's written some really good literature that kind of compares the benefits, because obviously you want it to be as cheap as possible without sacrificing quality, without sacrificing accessibility. And you can't always get all of those things at the same time. So I think, in terms of, again, the government purview and giving more power to them to control these things is a bit worrisome. Like, I think about Social Security, for example, is a great example. Like, you talk about, you don't want the middleman, but the government becomes the middleman. And that's not a good scenario either. We want to, again, decentralize these things. So for Social Security, if we all agree a social safety net's a good thing, well, instead of me paying in and having the government get that money and then paying it out the door, why couldn't we have a provident fund where they say, okay, you pay in, but you own that money, and maybe the employer contribution goes to fund people who aren't working, and then you actually have the ability to invest it in something instead of it going out the door and being spent on something else. It takes that power away from the government, but it still gets the same objective going. So I feel like that's where we can still solve these problems, but shrink that power and purview of the people who keep telling us that they have our best intentions at heart, but we know human nature, that's just not the case.
And I do know what you're referring to. I know that this is Rand Paul's idea. I don't think it's that far off. I do think that there is some merit to the idea of it. It's kind of like having like a 401k, like healthcare fund, I guess is what you would call it. I think it just really comes down to, like I said, we had a very interesting debate on our show not too long ago on the merits of UBI versus a federal jobs guarantee. And it's amazing how people go back and forth on one idea here, the other idea here. They don't see the importance of actually having multiple ideas on the table. They're very dogmatic, if you will, in what they believe, and thinking that, okay, well, this is, we have the right answer. That side doesn't know what they're talking about. And the way I see it, you have to be able to incorporate all different aspects of a system that can obviously get better. One of the things that we talk about a lot on our show is the fact that progressives and libertarians, while they do have significant differences, there's also a lot of significant things that they agree on. And being able to come to the table like we're trying to do is how we're going to get where we need to go.
No, I completely agree. I think that's been one of the most eye-opening things about writing The War on Small Business and having these discussions is that there really is not that much land sort of, in between where we are, that we're all trying to address the same issues. We're just coming at it from a different background. And I think that the important sort of differential that I see is having a really deep economic background and kind of being able to follow the trail of intentions versus outcomes, because there are a lot of things that are really good intentions that economically don't produce the outcomes that we're trying to get to. And so if we can all identify what those outcomes are and kind of think strategically, I agree. I think that there's a lot of ground, and I do think that progressives and people who are, libertarian or centrist, or like this whole like swath of the middle that's, considered themselves politically homeless, hat tip to Brent Fedesi, who always talks about it. I do think there's a really great opportunity for us to come together. And now's the time, because the government's done a really great job in dividing us. Instead of us pointing the fingers at them and holding them accountable, we're pointing the fingers at each other when we're the ones that should be coming up with some better solutions. And we may not come up with all the same solutions, but there are certainly places where I feel like, again, small business, I'm pretty sure almost everyone feels like the response and the picking of winners and losers and the telling big businesses that they were essential and small businesses they were non-essential, and putting in trillions of dollars into the market where 7 tech companies gained $3.4 trillion in value, while hundreds of thousands of small businesses were completely screwed over, not because they were too big to fail, not because they had done something wrong, but because the government told them they couldn't open. I mean, they subjugated their property rights. So I feel like there are these areas, and those are the places where we have like the closest alignment, which are kind of the easiest to tackle. We come together, we start doing these small things together, and then we get to know each other. And I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think that this also, and Jen, if you want to jump in.
I mean, like I'm so far out of this, only in that, like, to me, we're talking about affordable healthcare, and I just don't think it should be commodified at all. Like, I'm just sitting here in my own place. So I digress. So
I don't either, but I also do believe that you have to. I keep insisting, as I do all the time, that there is a hunger. There is a hunger when it comes to right-wing populism. People are going to paint it with a broad brush and say that everybody's a racist and everybody's this, that, and the other thing. We saw what the gentleman from, I think it was called Kareem Coffee or whatever it was the other day. The guy was on Joe Rogan, and he is as right-wing as it gets. And he basically said, the white supremacy nonsense, get the hell out of our side, because we don't need any of that. And that's what it comes down to. The economic populism
needs to come together.
This is where we're going to get it right, Carol. This is where we're going to get it right, because when the GOP and the Dems are talking about the culture war, they're not actually talking about things that are going to help us financially, because that's what we need to be focusing on. The second that we talk about economics, this is why I have listen, I disagree with a lot of what Rand Paul has to say, but in terms of the Ron Paul side of libertarian economics, there are a lot of ideas there that are correct. Again, the kill or be killed mindset, I do not agree with, because it doesn't work for everybody. But when it comes to government waste, when it comes to corporate waste, things of that nature, progressives agree with that 1,000%.
Yep, agree.
And filth and corruption and everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of things that we agree on. Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.